Good afternoon. Welcome to the Virginia edition of our state webinar series, exploring the findings from American Farmland Trust's recently released Farms Under Threat, the State of the States report. Before we get started, let me run through some quick logistics. Everyone has been muted, so no need to do that yourself. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, we will be allowing time for questions, and you can do so by going to the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. The orange arrow up at the top of that panel allows the panel to shrink and reopen. You'll see a questions section of that control panel. You can pop that section out by clicking on the little square on the right-hand side. That decouples it from the control panel, allowing you to type your questions or comments in there. We are happy to have comments in addition to questions. And we will have plenty of time for questions in the middle and at the end of the presentation. We're also recording this webinar and we'll send the link to everybody who registered. Please feel free to share this recording with others. So let me now introduce myself. I'm Chris Coffin. I'm American Farmland Trust's Senior Policy Advisor. I also direct our newly launched National Agricultural Land Network, which I'll talk about at the end of the webinar. Co-hosting with me is Jamie Morrell, AFT's Mid-Atlantic Regional Director. Jamie joined AFT in February, and she is based in Washington, D.C. And for those of you not familiar with American Farmland Trust, let me just do a quick introduction. We're a national nonprofit membership organization founded in 1980. Some know us best by our No Farms, No Food bumper sticker. We started as and remain an agricultural land trust. We care not just about retaining acres though, but inches as well, and have initiatives working with farmers to improve soil health and water quality. We also believe it is not farmland without farmers. So we focus on the viability side of agriculture, including training service providers to help next generation producers gain secure access to land. Our programming is grounded in research and informs our state and federal policy development and advocacy. And a note about our work in Virginia, we are promoting regenerative farming practices through the Sustainable Grazing Project. Working with cattle producers and partners in the Rappahannock region, we're enhancing the region's environmental and agricultural viability through holistic strategies that sequester carbon, improve soil health, support farms, and promote community well-being. We are pleased that many of our partners in that project are joining us today. So let me now turn it over to Jamie.
Wonderful, thanks so much, Chris. We are delighted to be joined today by many, many valued partners. These include the Office of the Governor of Virginia, the Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, Virginia Outdoors Foundation, Virginia State University, University of Virginia, Sweetbriar College, Piedmont Environmental Council, Friends of the Rappahannock, Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and many Virginia land trusts and local governments. I want to give a special shout out to our federal partners, especially USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. NRCS has been an integral partner in our Farms Under Threat research, and we want to thank them for their support and collaboration on this initiative. Now I'd like to introduce three very special guests. We have here with us today Secretary of Agriculture and Forestry, Bettina Ring, Commissioner of VDAC, Dr. Jewel Brownow, and Jennifer Perkins with the Office of Farmland Preservation at VDAC. We are so grateful to have the three of you here with us today. Thanks so much for joining us. So we invite the three of you to offer your perspectives on farmland loss in Virginia and how you're tackling this problem. So Secretary, maybe start with you.
Sure, and thank you so much for having us on today and for sharing this important study with everyone. We're very excited about it. We've had the opportunity to have a preview and have some more in-depth discussion around it, and it's just going to be a valuable tool as we move forward. In our secretariat, just for those that are on the line that may not know, we're very fortunate to be representing the #1 industry in the Commonwealth of Virginia, agriculture, and also the 3rd largest industry, which is forestry. And then tourism is our 2nd largest industry. And we know that agritourism, that really the 3 of those industries work so closely together, as well as ecotourism. But all of this really depends on us making sure that we have our land intact, that we have sustainable farmland and forest land, that we have working landscapes across the Commonwealth. We have 3 agencies within our secretariat, the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, and the Department of Forestry, and the Horse Racing Commission, because the horse industry is so important in the Commonwealth also. We will be hearing from Dr. Joel Brunner as well as from Jen Perkins on VDAC staff. And I know that we also have Amanda and Andrew from the Department of Forestry, their land conservation staff with the Department of Forestry. And the Department of Forestry holds a number of easements, over 180, probably close to 190 now in the state. And so working hand in hand, we try to do all we can to keep land intact, to keep it in forestry or farmland or both, and to keep it in the family. And so we have 3 top priorities: rural economic development, forest and farmland retention, and food security in our secretariat and as part of Governor Northam's administration. And those 3 are really very connected, and you'll be hearing about that today as the American Farmland Trust shares more about their study. And truly how we need to make sure we keep the land intact to be able to ensure all people have access to healthy and nutritious foods, to ensure that our rural economies across the state are robust. And so we need to make sure that we're working hand in hand with all of our partners to make that happen. I know we have a number of land trust partners on the call. We've worked very closely with American Farmland Trust, working with women landowners, looking at a learning circle and how we can share. I know they're working with Sweetbriar College, and we have someone on the webinar as well from there. And so again, it takes all of us working together to really ensure that we have healthy, sustainable ag land and forest land across the state. And I know you have a new board member who we work closely with, Ebony Alexander, the executive director of the Black Family Land Trust. Her office is in Durham, but her home is in Virginia, and she's a fantastic partner and I know a great addition to your board. So I'm going to turn things over to our Ag Commissioner now, but again, thank you for having us be part of today's webinar, and look forward to working with you moving forward.
Thank you, Secretary Ring, and this is Joel Brunner, Commissioner of the Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, and I echo Secretary Ring in thanking you all for allowing us to be a part of what you're going to talk about today, and the work that you've done has been incredible and very informative in terms of the direction that we need to think about in terms of future policies and programs. And in thinking about the great work that Secretary Ring is leading from the Secretary's office, you can tie it back to some of our history. You know, if you look back a long time ago in Virginia, land devoted to farming and forestry probably covered the majority of the state. And as you moved into the 60s, there were about 13.5 million acres of Virginia, were about 25 million in farmland remained. And by 2012, that total was about 8.3 million acres, a loss of more than 5 million acres of land, Virginia's farmland in 52 years. And the stats tell a similar story for our Virginia forests. In 2003, Virginia had 15.8 million acres of forest land, which represents a decline of about 1,800 acres since 1992. And I think the Virginia General Assembly recognized the loss of ag and forest lands and the negative impact it would have on the state. And so in 2001, they established the Office of Farmland Preservation within the Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. And so we've had that office within VDACs, and it really has some important missions One is to work with governmental and private organizations to help establish local PDR, Purchase of Development Rights programs, create programs to educate the public about the importance of farmland preservation. It helps farmers with farmland preservation efforts, and it also assists local governments in developing additional farmland preservation policies and programs, and administers our Virginia Farm Link program. And you're going to hear a little bit more about that in just a minute from Jen Perkins, who is the manager of the Office of Farmland Preservation. And looking at the factors that Virginia was assessed on, it was just really interesting to kind of see where we've done okay and where we could do a little bit better. In terms of property tax, since 1972, within the Virginia law was the use value taxation that was established to foster the preservation of real estate for agricultural, horticultural, forest, and open space use in the public interest. And so this is accomplished through the classification or special assessment and taxation of property in a way that promotes its preservation to help foster long-term public benefits. Currently, ag land is assessed at its value in agricultural use in 69 counties in Virginia and 18 cities in Virginia, and they have adopted these local use value ordinances in several other localities. So we continue to do work there. I'm also in working with DCR Governor Northam, dedicated to ensuring the highest conservation outcomes from state farms were spent on protecting land. And so the Conserve Virginia has been a program which is a key tool in guiding investments. It provides a map of Virginia's highest conservation land values. And the Conserve Virginia map includes more than 6 million acres of land that represent top priority conservation values in a variety of different categories. We've also had some discussions about soil health, I think, and there's a lot more to do in that area in terms of working with Virginia Cooperative Extension and our land grant institutions to figure out how we can promote those practices, and down the road how we can get monetary support that can help support the promotion of those practices through marketing programs and others. So I think there is more work that we can do there. And I also want to recognize Ebony Alexander with the Black Family Land Trust, who I've worked with, and Secretary Ring have worked with for a lot of years in various capacities, that have been very important in helping with the transition of lands from one generation to the next. So I'll stop there and I will turn it over to Jen Perkins, who coordinates our programs in the Office of Farmland Preservation, and she's going to speak specifically about some other great programs that we have at VDAX in greater detail. So Jen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, both Secretary Ring and Commissioner Brunner. I'm Jen Perkins in the Office of Farmland Preservation, and I wanted to just touch on 4 different programs that we have to promote farmland preservation in Virginia. So this will be a brief overview, but first, we have something called the Farmland Preservation Fund, which is a grant program that provides matching funds to localities that have active purchase of development rights, or PDR programs. And the General Assembly appropriates funding annually. And since the first grant round in 2008, VDAX has provided matching funds for 106 easements covering over 14,000 acres in 16 localities. Second, as we all know, the nation is about to see a significant shift in wealth as the baby boomers pass their assets to the next generation. And this presents a unique challenge for farmland, as families often think the only way to pass these assets in an equitable way means dividing the farm. So we provide information and workshops on transition planning throughout the Commonwealth to help families think through ways to pass on their wealth while keeping farm and forest land intact in family and in production. Third, and relatedly, for those farmers who do not have an obvious heir, as Commissioner Brunner mentioned, we run the FarmLink website. And this is an online database geared towards connecting farm owners with farmers, often new and beginning farmers, in search of agricultural land. And one of the things that makes FarmLink so helpful is that these farm owners are not always simply looking to sell their land, but are possibly looking for farmers who want to lease or lease to own, which can be a more accessible way for new farmers to enter the industry. And then finally, FEDAX has a grant program called the Governor's Agriculture and Forestry Industries Development Fund Planning Grant, also known as the AFT Planning Grant. And this grant is designed to help localities think strategically about encouraging agriculture and forestry in their communities, including how these industries can support land conservation efforts. And we've funded a variety of grants, but some examples include an impact of agricultural study and several cost of community services studies, which focus on determining the economic impact of ag and forestry and the benefits of these industries and their conservation to taxpayers. Some other examples include studies on green infrastructure and promoting agritourism. So this was just obviously a very quick snapshot. I don't want to take up too much time, but more information on all of these programs is available on our website, and you should always feel free to call or email me with any questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Secretary Ring, Commissioner Brunner, and Jennifer Perkins. We really appreciate your thoughtful comments, and we look forward to engaging further with you on ways to keep farmland and farming. So thank you. Chris, I'll turn it back over to you now.
I believe, yes, I'm sorry. I was speaking while on mute. So apologies for that. Thank you, Jamie, and thank you again to the Secretary, Commissioner, and Jennifer for some really helpful perspectives right there at the outset. And we're so happy that you are going to be with us for the duration of the webinar. So let's now talk about the findings from this report. Today, we're focusing on the state of the states, which is the second in this research series. State of the States paints a striking picture of the threats facing working farms and ranches in every state and documents the steps every state has taken to protect their agricultural land base from development. We used a multi-pronged approach that included advanced spatial mapping to identify threats and an in-depth analysis of state policy responses. We're using this report to raise public awareness, to inform state and federal policy, and to encourage more direct and permanent agricultural land protection. For those of you who did not join us for our launch event last month, I just want to touch very quickly on our national findings. We looked at the period from 2001 to 2016, a period of historically low housing starts. And despite that, the US converted 11 million acres of agricultural land. That's equivalent to all the land planted in the US to fruits, nuts, and vegetables in 2017. The majority of that conversion was to low-density residential land use. We've known this type of conversion was happening because all across the country, scattered large lot housing has been fragmenting and disrupting farming and ranching for years. But until this report, no one has ever been able to map it and measure it. And once we mapped it, we realized just how big of a threat it is. And sadly, more than 1/3 of the land converted, about 4.5 million acres, was some of the most productive land in the country. This is land we've identified as nationally significant, or land that is best suited for intensive food and crop production. And as you can see from the next map, agricultural land conversion is a growing problem across the US. It's no longer confined to large metropolitan areas. Small cities are sprawling, and the proliferation of farmettes and ranchettes on their outskirts has created hotspots of conversion in virtually every state. So now we're going to dive into the Virginia data, and we're going to do this through our interactive website. And Jamie and I are joined today by our colleague, Beth Fraser, who is helping us to navigate through the website. So thank you, Beth. Let's start with this Reports and Data tab on the right-hand side. This is where you'll find fact sheets that describe the methodologies we used. There's also a link to the full report and to an executive summary. If you're interested in getting access to the geospatial data we used, we are going to make that available. You can request it by going to this geospatial data layers where Beth has the pointer right there. That will take you to a form, and once you fill it out, we will be back in touch with more information about what will be available and when it will be available. So now let's go to the drop-down menu and choose Virginia. And you can see this takes you to both the spatial data and the policy scorecard. We're going to start on the spatial data, and we're actually going to start by pointing out this downloadable Virginia conversion summary. We made these 2-page PDFs so that it would enable people to have access to just the sort of top talking points and infographics that can be easily used for your website, that can be used for your outreach with members, to landowners, to policymakers, to journalists, any number of uses for them. We hope that you will find them helpful. They're particularly helpful because if you have bandwidth problems like many of us, having just 2 pages to download makes it a lot easier. And there is also a policy one that we're not going to look at, but know that it's available as well. So now let's go to the 4 categories of spatial data. We're going to start with land cover and use. We used multiple national data sets to develop the best available spatial inventory of agricultural land use in the US. You can zoom in on this data layer to identify every type of land use in the state, including land that we've identified as low density residential development. It also includes a first ever attempt to spatially identify woodland associated with a farm. Our mapping shows about 8.2 million acres of agricultural land, including 3 million acres of cropland, 2.3 million acres of pasture, and 2.8 million acres of woodland associated with farms. Let's go to the PVR values now. For farms under threat, we wanted to analyze the quality of land that is being lost to development, not just the quantity. So we created, with the help of a national panel of experts, an index to quantify the productivity, versatility, and resiliency of every acre of land in the US. This map shows the range of these PVR values across the state. The darker the green, the higher the PVR value, and the higher the PVR value, the higher the suitability for long-term intensive crop production, especially for food crops. You can also, Beth, if you take a minute to toggle with the satellite view, you can also know that, again, these, where the higher the PVR values are, the lighter green here. And just know that you can change the transparency so you can see what is underneath in terms of all of these data layers. But it might actually be easier to see when we go to the nationally significant land. So you'll see that around 3.2 million acres of land in Virginia falls into this category, which is 40% of the state's agricultural land base. About 2.2 million acres of this is cropland, with about 425,000 acres of pasture and nearly 600,000 acres of woodland. And again, these are lands that had the top range of PVR values that we created a nomenclature for them of nationally significant. And the reason we point this out, because the loss of this highly productive land has both economic and environmental implications. When high PVR value land is impacted by development, intensive food production is pushed to more marginal lands. What does this do economically for farmers? It means that input costs are typically higher and crop yields are typically lower. And environmentally, it means that soils degrade more quickly. So lastly, let's look at conversion. This data, again, looked at 2001 to 2016, a period of low housing starts with a deep recession in the middle. We mapped the conversion of land to 2 types. The first is urban and highly developed land use. This includes the traditional culprits in farmland conversion, so expanding residential, commercial, and industrial areas, typically in cities and towns. This category, though, also includes rural, industrial, and energy production sites. So you can see in here oil and well pads and solar panel installations. The second type is low-density residential development. This is the first effort of its kind to quantify the extent of large lot housing on the agricultural land base. And these areas range from lower density subdivisions to rural areas where more and more individual houses are being built. You can see that the majority of conversion, nearly 80% over this time frame, was to low density residential land use. Now, it's important to note that there may still be active agriculture on the land designated as LDR, and some of that production can be profitable, but we also know that LDR tends to be a transitional land use. Land in Virginia that was considered LDR in 2001 was 7 times more likely to be converted to UHD by 2016 than other types of ag land. And we know that continued conversion to LDR increases the management challenges for producers who have to deal with farming in and around non-farming neighbors. Total agricultural land converted over this period of just 15 years was nearly 340,000 acres. About 122,000 of this was woodland, followed by cropland conversion at 110,000 acres, followed by pasture land with 108,000 acres. And of the land converted, over 119,000 acres were considered nationally significant. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Jamie to offer some perspectives on the findings.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris. So Chris just very quickly went through our spatial data on land cover and use, PVR values, nationally significant agricultural land and conversion. Beth, would you mind, just so we can give our participants an idea of how closely you can zoom in to the data, if you can maybe zoom in a bit on the Richmond area where we see a lot of that conversion taking place. Thank you. So we hope that you all will really get into this tool and toggle between the different data layers and to hopefully find ways to be able to use this new data to further your farmland protection efforts. So I would like to open it up now to the Secretary, Commissioner, and Jen to kind of get your perspective or insights on the loss of farmland and conversion that we're seeing in Virginia and how the department is working to address that conversion. And whoever wants to address that, please do.
I'll jump in first and then turn to Jewel and Jen to add anything. And also, you know, Andrew and Amanda may not be able to speak since they're not on as a presenter, but if they want to add anything in the chat box. I think when we see what we've been watching with conversion of land in the state, certainly the Golden Crescent, which from Northern Virginia, you know, sort of down to Virginia Beach, we've seen, you know, continued sort of pressures there over time. We know that there are a number of different types of pressures on the land, and I think that, you know, really speaks to why it's important for us all to work hand in hand with our land conservation partners and to have as many tools in the toolbox as possible to ensure that we maintain working landscapes. And as you mentioned earlier, we know that these lands are not just valuable for economic purposes, but that they bring many environmental benefits from ensuring we have clean drinking water to biodiversity and beyond. And so I think it's really how do we best identify where those most threatened lands, but most important lands are. How do we make sure we have many tools in that toolbox and working closely with a number of our partners that may be more involved in land use policy, the Farm Bureau and others, that we really see, you know, and I think again your study is going to shed a lot of light on this as we move forward and working with our decision makers, looking at where the gaps are, where do we need more resources, and then how do we work hand in hand. And I think sometimes we used to see agriculture and forestry as being two separate things, but I think to recognize, and you've done this with your data, that many of these landowners own both woodland and farmland. And being able to make sure that we have resources available to them, technical assistance, that we have cost share programs at the federal and state level, that we have as many tools, creative tools in that toolbox as possible so that they can keep that land when it's in their family. If we have new farmers coming on that have an interest, that we have programs like FarmLink, and that we can make those lands more accessible. And again, working with the Black Family Land Trust, we've been able to pass some legislation this past year that will give us more tools to be able to address heir property issues and to look at African American land retention in the state. And so we really, again, it's working in partnership and collaboration and using great tools and studies like you provided. So Jewel, Jen, other thoughts that you have?
Yes, thank you, Secretary Ring, in talking about working together. And as we think about some specific things at VDAX, I think we, in working with our partners, are trying to determine what are those issues that really impact the loss of land. And I'll say, for example, you mentioned solar panels, and of course we know solar energy is very important, but we understand that you have to make critical decisions about where you're going to put those solar panels. And so, you know, we think about some of those issues, and I think there's opportunities for VDAX to help with those conversations about, you know, where do we put those solar panels so that they bring that important energy to localities, but they're not on the most valuable ag or forest lands. And those are the types of conversations that we will need to continue to have to ensure that we keep our most valuable lands valuable, and that we're not having to produce our food on less suitable land, but it can be produced on the best land. Other conversations are in terms of land access, and I know Secretary Ring mentioned working with the African American community in terms of land transition, but land accessibility has been quite an issue. You know, how do farmers of all backgrounds, specifically Black and brown farmers, get more access to those highly valuable lands in order to make sure that they have a place in food production? That's another important conversation that I think that VDAX can be very helpful with. So there's some specific issues that we see that we can have in terms of making decisions going forward, and those decisions are helped along with valuable information and resources such as what you're providing in this report. And so, Jen, if you have anything else to add, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add beyond what you all have said, except just to echo the importance of our partnerships and, you know, how great it is to have data-driven information like this as we begin to really coordinate our efforts across the Commonwealth and, you know, sort of maybe tie in some of the work that we're doing with conservation with the issues with supply chains and things, some of the weaknesses we've seen coming out of the coronavirus. So anyway, yeah, I'm just looking forward to continuing to work with everybody on all of this. Thanks.
Great. Thank you all, and thank you, Jamie. We're going to now move to the policy scorecard, but before we do, we actually want to launch a poll because we want to ask everybody on the webinar what you see as the biggest conversion threats for Virginia over the next 10 to 20 years. And we ask this now because when we start thinking about policy and policy responses, those responses are going to depend on what people think are really those biggest drivers of conversion going forward. So take a minute. If you think that there's a driver that's not on here, feel free to write it in, and you can also vote for more than one. And if you're having any problems voting, it could be that you are in full screen mode and need to come out of full screen to be able to vote. Okay, what are we seeing here? This is interesting in that it is very similar to what we've seen. We've now done 18 different state webinars, and the two drivers identified here are the same two that in every other state have been at the top, which is more of the same in terms of poorly planned residential, commercial, industrial development, and this growing challenge around generational transfer. But it's interesting that for Virginians that this concern about energy development is fueling a great amount of interest, and we can talk about that a little bit more. So let's turn to the policy scorecard. Our intention with the scorecard is to highlight effective elements of state policies that address what have been these historic drivers of conversion. So poorly planned development, weak agricultural viability. Again, we know that when farmers are profitable, they tend to keep their land in agriculture. So ag viability is critical to retaining farmland. And then lastly, the fact that land is most vulnerable when it transfers between those generations. So this is our first effort at a state policy scorecard, even though we have been involved in state and federal policy development since our founding. We know that there are many ways that states support agriculture. We heard the Secretary mention and the Commissioner mention some of those. This is not an attempt to score them all, because we know that there are many different ways that states are supporting agriculture, all of them important. Instead, we focused on 6 specific policies and programs that tie directly to the land. And so the ones that we looked at were purchase of agricultural conservation easement or purchase of development rights programs. Again, we looked this only at the state level. We were not looking at county or local programs. These are voluntary programs that compensate landowners who choose to place a permanent agricultural conservation easement on their property. In Virginia, we scored both the VDAC's Farmland Preservation Fund and its work with local PDR programs and the Virginia Land Conservation Foundation. We looked at land use planning and growth management. These are program things that stabilize the land base. Most states, including Virginia, delegate planning authority to local governments, and planning and zoning decisions are driven largely, as we know, at the county and municipal level. But states can play an active and important role in guiding and supporting these decisions in a way that supports and retains the agricultural land base. That's why we looked at those here. We looked at property tax relief. So in Virginia, the use value, the land use assessment program, again, these are reducing property taxes paid on agricultural land in recognition that working lands require far less in municipal services than residential development. We looked at agricultural district programs. These are voluntary in those states that have them. Participating farmers receive a variety of protections and incentives that differ by states. Some limit annexation, some limit use of eminent domain, some offer protection from siting of public facilities and infrastructure, some offer tax incentives, and some require district enrollment to participate in state PACE programs. And then lastly, we looked at 2 programs focused on that generational transfer and land access. These are farm link programs that can be administered by public or private entities, offering a range of services from online real estate postings to technical assistance, training and educational resources. And we looked at state leasing programs. So these are programs or policies that make state-owned land available to farmers. Sometimes that's their primary purpose, but more often agricultural use is secondary to another purpose. So with that, let's look quickly at how Virginia scored. If we can scroll down a little bit, and so that you see that Virginia is above the median in planning, well above the median in property tax, well above the median in ag districts, at the median in farm link, at the median in PACE, and has a low score on the state leasing front. And I just want to point out one point and I think that this is underscored by looking at something like FarmLink, there aren't many states that have support for FarmLink programs. So that median is just the median of those states that have programs, not the median of all states. So know that Virginia in something like FarmLink is doing way above most other states. And I would just point out that as the secretary talked about the toolbox, the fact that Virginia uses all 6 of these types of programs and policies, again, a little bit more or less, depending on the score here, is showing that you have a diversity of tools, which is super important. And again, there are only a handful of states, I think it's 5 or fewer states, that have each of these 5 policies. So again, Virginia should be applauded in that respect. So we're just going to go through a couple of these in a little bit of depth, just so that you see. We just want to make this so that people know how to use and navigate through this. We're going to start with PACE programs. And one point that I just want to say at the outset here is that the scorecard did not include conservation tax credits. We know that the Virginia Land Preservation Tax Credit has been hugely important to permanent land protection and represents a $1.7 billion investment, if I read the right report this morning, on the part of the Commonwealth. We are going to do a 2.0 version of this scorecard. We are hoping to include tax credits. They've been a little hard to figure out how much of that tax credit goes to land that is specifically in agricultural use. That was our challenge in thinking about it, but now we're ready to dig in and try and figure that out. But again, we scored both the Farmland Preservation Program and the fund and the Virginia Land Conservation Foundation. It's great to hear and know that Virginia is making significant investments into working lands protection recently. Where states that have scored higher than Virginia is in part around larger investments in the program per capita. So per capita investment in Virginia has been about 10 cents. In the states that have been doing this for a long time, that investment per capita is sometimes in the several dollars. And that manifests itself in the acres protected to acres converted, because that number, as you see on the far right side, is somewhat low. Another important point to note here is the availability of federal matching funds for farmland protection, both through the NRCS Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, as well as through the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. Both provide a 1-to-1 match or a great deal for taxpayers. The 2018 Farm Bill also eliminated the cash match requirement for that agricultural conservation easement program. So landowners willing to donate 50% of the value of their easement can participate in the program if they work with a land trust or local PDR program. We hope that that $2 billion funding for ASEP and the increased funding for RCPP will help to increase their utility in Virginia. So let's go quickly to land use planning. Virginia gets credit here for requiring local comprehensive planning, and that is a very significant step. And we weighed something like that as quite a bit because it's an important step. Just to point out that states that scored higher here either provide support for local comprehensive plan development generally or farmland protection planning specifically, and high scoring states have specific state goals around either growth management or retaining agricultural land, and then require consistency between those state goals and those regional and local planning efforts. And just an aside here, Jen, when you mentioned your planning grants, we may have overlooked those. I don't know whether we should have considered that as farmland protection planning, but we'll go back and look at that and see in the next version whether Virginia should get a score for that. Let me then just look at ag districts, Beth. Again, this is an area where Virginia scores well. Agricultural, those local ag and forestal districts have been around for a long time in Virginia. We note the value of allowing those automatic use value assessment for farmland in those districts. Virginia also gets credit for requiring local planning authorities to review and approve those districts. So there's a link to that local land use planning. Where some states have scored higher is having more integration between those local agricultural districts and some of their state farmland protection work. So I just again want to note that FarmLink, that the state is doing a great job. It gets high points there for its work. And Beth, if you can just go back out of here just to look at the overall score again. In looking at FarmLink, again, I think the only reason why Virginia did not get a higher score was simply because it compared to a couple of other states, it didn't have as robust a number of listings on its site, but it sounds like that is something that is being ramped up, which is great. And then lastly, on state leasing, we like to point this out, that states that scored high on state leasing are those that have done a comprehensive inventory of state-owned land beyond just those lands managed by natural resource areas. And back to the point that the commissioner made in terms of land access, we really think that this represents an opportunity for states to look at what land might be managed by a variety of different agencies, particularly smaller plot ones that might be closer to urban areas that might be suitable for a wide variety of next generation producers. So that's why we pointed out. I think I'm going to stop there. I hope it was a helpful cruise through the findings. Please do continue to write in your questions. And we're going to launch one more poll quickly, which is for Virginia, which policies do you think would be most valuable to adopt or improve? Note that we didn't have room. We apologize for both that state-owned land and for FarmLink. Please feel free to write those in if you feel those are the most important. And we'll take a minute. Again, you can select more than one, but we'll take a minute for voting. Great, okay. All right, this is interesting. The three ones at the top of people's list: property tax relief, land use planning, and PACE programs. So Secretary and Commissioner and Jennifer, that would be great to sort of think about these as we're looking at tweaks on the policy fronts for Virginia. I will say that the National Agricultural Land Network will be hosting a series of policy webinars beginning in the early fall. We're going to dig into each one of these to say, where are those states that are the top scorers? What are they doing? What can other states learn from them? What are some of the and what are the ways to integrate some of these efforts to make a suite of policies that work together to protect and retain land. Going out now of the website, just want to note that we did not include protected land in our spatial data layers. That's because there's no comprehensive national data set focused on agricultural land, protected agricultural land specifically. We're building this new database now. If you have not heard from us and you are an entity that holds ag conservation easements, please write your name of your org or entity into that question panel and we will be in touch, because we don't want to miss anybody in terms of that data layer. So let's stop, Jamie, and see if there are questions.
Sure, we've got a few questions, and given our time left today. I'll ask a couple of them, and we promise that if we don't get to all of the questions, we will send answers to them to all of you after the webinar. So one question, Chris, is around getting a better understanding our methodology in terms of how we quantified farmland conversion. So what was the methodology for making those calculations?
Well, so first I would refer everybody to the spatial, as we pointed out, that reports and data tab. There is something that explains the methodology in great detail. I will say that in terms of the low density residential land use, which is the newest piece of it, is that was modeling, and we did it based on essentially taking by county what was the we calculated the median farm size by county, and then we created, I don't know how you talk about that, you can tell I'm not a researcher, but we created the sort of percentiles. We took the bottom 10th percentile of what that acreage was for the smallest 10% of farm sizes in a particular county. We then took the US housing census, which provides by, I don't know what the level is, but tract data on how many houses there are in a particular housing census tract. And we put those two together to come up with the low density residential use. So let me I think that's as much as I'll say right there, and the rest of it, you can find more specificity in that for the reports.
Great, and then maybe the last one that I'll pose now is, so what was AFT's thinking around not considering the land preservation tax credit?
Well, I think that I said it. I think that the reason why is that we were challenged. Those land preservation tax credits in a lot of states, they're not segregated out by type, so that it wasn't easy to tell whether that credit was being used for agricultural land, that was the purpose of that protection, that it wasn't just agricultural land being protected, but it was being protected for continued agricultural use. Again, many easements will not allow commercial use of agriculture. So having to go into depth to figure out whether there's the amount of land being protected through each of those credits. I do seem to recall that Virginia actually does characterize them by type, but that is not true for all states. So again, it's something that we want to do. We just did not have the time in this first round.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Super. So let's move on. Thank you. So time is not on our side in saving our farm and ranch land, which is why AFT just announced a bold goal of doubling the amount of permanently protected farmland by 2040 and reducing the rate of farmland conversion from 2,000 acres a day to 500 acres a day by 2040. You can see on this slide here, some of the ways that AFT will be strengthening its commitment to farmland protection. Here in Virginia, you'll see a number of ways we plan to do that. Given our remaining time, I'll just touch on two. In Virginia, we're hoping to leverage the National Agricultural Land Network, which Chris briefly mentioned earlier, to provide capacity building and peer-to-peer learning for organizations who are or want to be taking an active role in protecting farmland. The last point I'll just briefly mention is around promoting research-based decision-making. We plan to use the findings of the Farms Under Threat report to guide our activities on the ground. And we are on the lookout for opportunities to build on this research and to learn more about what's happening to farmland on a local level. We've provided some important spatial data layers that can be used by states, but our level of analysis really needs to be supplemented at the state level. What more could Virginia do to both track its agricultural land use changes and trends, as well as potentially set a goal for retaining and protecting some percentage of remaining farmland? Virginia does a very good job of coordinating a suite of policies around property tax, ag districts, and farm viability. And I think our message here is that Virginia needs to keep its foot on the accelerator. It can't let up given that development pressure is continuing. And perhaps it needs to consider ways to strengthen its land use planning to promote compact development, for example. Again, we give Virginia a lot of credit for the outstanding work that's already happening, it's happening now, and really continuing to focus on tools around farmland protection, access, and generational transfer will be key. AFT believes that all farmland is important and provides important co-benefits, but all farmland is not created equally. And we believe that a special effort needs to be made to protect the state's most productive farmland. So Chris, I'll stop there and I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. In just the last couple of minutes, I want to talk about both the Farmland Information Center and the network. So the Farmland Information Center is a collaboration we've had with NRCS for decades. It is a clearinghouse of information on everything around agricultural land, especially around land protection. It has a lot of resources around land use planning, but that is an area because of the interest that we are going to be building up those resources around that. There's increasingly amount of information around land access, and a lot of work that we have done and others have done around land access tools and strategies. Same with farm transfer and succession. And I really do encourage people to use it because it has statistics. It has sort of materials that make the case. We post things that come in from groups around the country and academic institutions that are doing studies around farm and rangeland protection. So know that you can go both use the website, but you can also either email in or call in with a question, and somebody will be there to answer it. And I just want to note also that we have an increasing number of materials around the ACEP program, and hope that people will make use of that as well. And then on the National Agricultural Land Network, this is something that AFT has just launched, and it's intended to build the collective capacity of all of us. That's running the gamut from NGOs to county agencies to state departments of agriculture and state departments of natural resources, to learn from each other and to have advanced conversations of some of the challenges that we are collectively facing. And I think about some of the things that we've just talked about on this webinar, the importance of how do you incorporate land access and farmland protection? How do you think about new land access tools for Black and Brown communities? How do we do more to be promoting soil health and other conservation practices with farmers who are farming protected land? So there's any number of conversations that we hope to encourage and facilitate, conversations about how to make the ACEP program work more effectively in any particular state, conversations around the RCPP program and how to make that work as well. So we hope this will be a network that can be of use to everybody. I realize I forgot to launch the last poll, which is as we're launching this network, which of these types of information and training would you find most valuable? So let's just take a minute to finish this out. And while we're doing this, I do want to say and thank you to Ebony Alexander with the Black Family Land Trust, who is also going to join us as a member of the steering committee for the network. So we are very happy to have her as part of that, as well as being on the AFT board. And I think with that, well, we're going to wait for a minute while everyone else is voting. Let's give it just another minute or two, because then I do want to turn it back to you, the dream team of the Secretary Commissioner and Jennifer, for any closing thoughts that you might have. Let me just look at this. This is very useful to know that people are interested in how do you do those state and local ag land protection plans and additional information around easements. So thank you very much for weighing in here, everyone. So with that, let me turn it just back to the Secretary and Commissioner for any final thoughts.
Yes, this is Bettina. Thank you again. It's been a great webinar, and look forward to continuing the conversation and really getting into this in a way that we can see, you know, all of the partners that are on the webinar and those that couldn't be with us today bring different strengths to the table. And so how do we really, I think, lay out a strategy about how we're going to move forward, who's going to do what, and then how we're going to support each other, again, working with and through each other to accomplish these common goals. And I think what's really nice about what you pulled together here is that you've really been able to look at, you know, where do we have lands that are economically viable? And that's one piece that we've been missing around some of the data, because we know, those of us that work in agriculture, how important it is to have markets for our producers, to have the infrastructure that they need in place to be able to have sustainable farmland, and to be able to put these different pieces together to say, here are our valuable farmland, here's the valuable farmland in the state, here's where we have opportunities to really sustain that. Like you mentioned in your 5 points, we also don't want to forget the rest. So now that we look at, you know, again, what tools do we bring to the table? Many of our land trusts, Piedmont Environmental Council, others have been focusing on agriculture and working landscapes, and again, using tools that we have, like our Generation Next program, looking at transition planning for landowners and working in partnership with Cooperative Extension and the Department of Forestry. So it's really bringing all these together. So we'd love to continue the dialogue and see how we can really work together to make sure we're accomplishing more moving forward. But thanks for all your hard work in making this possible and pulling this webinar together today.
Great, thank you. Jamie, any last thoughts?
No, just to thank you to the 3 of you, and then to all of our participants for joining us today. I will follow up tomorrow with an email with a recording to this, as well as some additional resources.
Great, thank you all. Have a great afternoon.